Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be covering the topic of nested conditional control structures. So specifically, we're going to be learning about what a nested conditional control structure is and how to use it. We're going to talk about coding conventions as they apply to nested control structures. And then we're also going to go over how to debug control structures. Conditional control structures, especially once nesting gets involved. As you'll see, they can become quite complicated. So we're going to provide some debugging tips for you. Basically, nesting control structures means that within the statement group of one control structure, conditional control structure, you include another conditional control structure. So for example, if we have an if statement with its test condition and then its opening brace, these opening and closing braces define the statement group of that if statement. Well, within this if statement, we've actually included another conditional control structure, another if statement. And then actually within this if statement, we've included another conditional control structure, this statement. And these actually should be indented one further. And so what you can see is that you can, in PHP, there's no limit to the number of levels, how deep you can nest control structures. And what it allows you to do is to achieve fine-grained control over the conditional execution of conditional segments of your code. So for example, maybe you have a section of code that you want to run if someone's a female, their age is over 25, and they're over 60 inches tall. In this case, the code we'd execute would be, you are a female over age 25, over 5 feet tall. Using nested if control structures like this allows you to achieve sort of that fine-grained control to only execute code based on, if multiple conditions are met. So let's actually go and take a look at a function or a script we've created called nested.php. And basically what it does is, before I get into this stuff here at the top, let's look at the code for it. Basically, it takes two get parameters, one called function and one called arg. Function can take on one of three different values: date, to upper, or to lower. And what that's going to correspond to is the date function, the string to upper function, and the string to lower function, which we learned about. Arg is going to refer to an argument that you would pass to these functions. So basically, in our script, by passing a function, the function name by the function get variable, and the function argument by the arg get variable, what we can do is set up our code so that it'll run the specified function on the argument that was requested. So the first thing we do is we actually, using the ternary operator, we create short versions of our get variables. We're called one function and one arg. Function, again, is the name of the function, and arg is the argument we'll be passing to it. Then we have a couple of nested control structures. So the first test we do is we test if function was not equal to null. So that's saying, was function provided as a get variable? If that's true, then we go ahead and proceed into that if statement. If not, we're going to output a message and say no function was selected. Now once we get in here, we perform another test with an if statement. Is argument not equal to null? So if function wasn't equal to null, but argument was, then we're going to output a message that says no function argument was provided. If not, we're going to go ahead and enter the if statement group. Within this if statement group, which we enter if function is not null and arg is not null, what we have is a switch statement. And it evaluates, or it runs over the variable function, which is the name of the function passed in. And what it does is it compares that name to each of these three different cases: date, to upper, and to lower. If it matches any of those cases, what it's going to do is it's going to run that corresponding function with the arg, or the argument that was passed in via get. And if a function was passed in, an argument was passed in, but the function name is not one of these four, it's not one of the ones recognized, then it's going to, by default, its default case is going to output a message that says invalid function was requested. So what I have up here is a form I've created that uses the get method, and it makes basically testing these out a little bit easier. And you can see that it has the three functions selected for which this code can process. we actually look at the source code for this, we can see that this select drop-down box has three options whose values are date, to upper and to lower, which match those cases in our switch statement. So if I select date and then I pass an argument to it, and we know the date function basically outputs a formatted date, and it does so based on a formatting string we provide to it. And so I want to output the month, or the day, the month, and the year. One way to do that is with the characters J and Y. And if we go ahead and click the call the function button, we can see that it outputs the current date, June 27, 2011. Likewise, if we do string to upper and we pass it a lowercase string and we call the function, the results we get is lower. It's turned to all uppercase. Now if we use the string to lower function and we put an uppercase function, or an uppercase string, and we call it, it's going to convert it to lowercase. So as you can see, by passing in the function name and an argument value, and then using these set of nested control structures, here we have a switch statement nested within an if statement, nested within another if statement. And basically what we do is we compare one of the get variables, in this case function, to a bunch of different cases, and then we use the other argument, the other get variable passed in, to go ahead and run a function based off of that. So that's sort of making use, how you can make use of nested conditional control structures. Now I just want to talk about coding conventions that we're going to use for nested control structures. And basically, the way it's going to work is when you nest a control structure within another one, you're going to indent the entire nested control structure one indent deeper than the enclosing structure. And we saw that here in nested.php. If we look at the code for that, we can see that here we have an if statement, and within that we've nested a switch statement. And as you can see, the switch statement is one indent further than the enclosing control structure. And that said, when you do nest a control structure, the same indentation rules should apply for that control structure. So for example, we know that for a switch statement, all of the case statements are one indent deeper than the switch keyword. So when we nest a switch statement within an if statement, we still indent all of these one extra indent. So actually, by the time we get down to these statements here, based on our rules that we actually have this break statement is indented four indents deep. One for this if, one for this switch, one for this case, and one for indenting the case statements. So now I just want to talk a little bit about debugging control structures. As you can see that when you start adding a lot of nested control structures, the code can get very complicated. You got a lot of test conditions, a lot of curly braces, a lot of colons, a lot of break statements, or semicolons and break statements, things that are easy to mess up on occasion. So debugging them can be quite challenging. Sometimes you find yourself, common questions you might be asking yourself are, why is the code in this if statement not executing when it's supposed to? I've supplied the inputs that I thought was supposed to make it happen. Why isn't that happening? On the converse of that, why isn't the code in a particular if statement executing, which is right here? And some of the common errors that occur in our control structures are incorrectly specifying test conditions for your control structures, for example, an if test condition, forgetting a break statement in a switch statement, and then also one that can be kind of the most deceiving is incorrectly placing or omitting an opening or closing curly brace. So let's look at the first one, incorrectly specified test conditions. If we go back to our nested.php, let's say we actually misspelled date here, and we actually put date 1, for example. If we go to our code, this is the code behind it, nested.php, and we change date to date 1, save it, and we refresh the page. Now when we go up here and we try to run our date function, and we press try to output a formatted date, and we call the function, instead of getting formatted date, we're getting invalid function requested. Well, why is that? Well, what happened is we specified a function called date. However, when we went through our switch statement, and actually this is not the updated version because this is hard coded into the HTML. Let's go look at the code. what's going to happen is the function, it's going to have a function value, it's going to have an argument value. When it enters the switch statement, it's going to have the function variable is going to be set to date, and it's going to be looking for date. It doesn't find it here because we've mistyped it. It doesn't find it here, it doesn't find it here, so what does it do? It outputs the default statement which says invalid function is requested. So that's one way where misspelling like a test condition can cause problems. Another one could be if we leave out a break statement. So for example, let's say we leave out the break statement here. We know from what we learned about the switch statement that once a case is matched within a switch function, every statement is executed until a break or the end of the switch statement is reached. So by leaving out the break statement here, what's going to happen is if we select date and it matches, we're going to echo this statement, and then instead of breaking out of this switch statement and back into the whatever statement follows it, we're actually going to go down here and execute the next line of code it finds, which is this echo statement. So this statement is going to be echoed as well. Then it reaches a break and it's going to break out. So we save this and we refresh it, and we try to run the same thing as before. Now we've corrected, well, it looks like it already did it, but let me do it anyways. What's going to happen is we call the function. It's going to output the date as we expected, but then also what it's going to do is it's going to output that next line of code, which as we saw was string to upper. So what it's actually going to do is convert that argument we passed in, which was a date formatting string, and just capitalize it and output it. And you know, this could go even a step further. If we, let's say we forgot to include the break statement here, then it's also going to call the string to lower function. So if we refresh this page again, which is going to submit the same get values, we can see it also added it in lowercase. So that's one error that can also happen with control structures. So let me go ahead and fix these back. Oops. Save it and reload it just to make sure everything is working as normal. Okay. Test out one of the functions. Okay, so everything's working as it's supposed to. So those are the two problems that can often happen that we just looked at: invalid or incorrectly specified test conditions and the forgetting of a break statement. Also, you can incorrectly place or omit a curly brace, which can cause a lot of problems. So it makes it hard to figure out what's going on, because PHP is going to give you an error, but sometimes, you know, usually the error says the error occurred on line 21, but maybe the error actually didn't occur on line 21, it occurred early in the file, and we'll show what that looks like now. If we go and look at, for example, let's go, we're going to look at this file called, or this script called debugtest.php. If we go and look at it in the code, we have the same function table, or excuse me, the same form at the beginning that allows us to select a function and an argument. And then what it does is we have similar code as in the nested.php, except I've just removed this inner switch statement, and instead of the switch statement I've just put an if statement that that always evaluates true, and instead of processing or calling the function, it just outputs a bunch of sample text. And the reason I put, you'll see why I put so many sample text lines here in a minute. So when I go ahead and I run this function, or run this form, what it should do is, if I pass it a valid function name and a valid argument, it should reach here and output all of these sample lines of text. So if we go and look at debug test, and I call the date function JMY, and it's not even going to matter what I put in because we're not calling the functions anymore, and press call function, you can see it outputs all these lines of sample text. Now, one error that's common that can cause a lot of problems is, let's say we actually forget this last closing brace for the if statement. If we save it, we might look at it and everything might look okay. So we go ahead and we run the file, and we refresh the page to run it again with the same values. We're going to get an error. It says you have a unexpected error on line 76. So if we go and look back here, the error that we omitted was all the way up here, but it's saying the error is occurring on line 76. Now the reason that that's happening is, if we look at this from the PHP interpreter's point of view, for this internal if statement, once it reaches this opening bracket, it evaluates all these statements as being part of this if statement. When it reaches the first closing bracket, it says, okay, I'm done with this if statement. Then, when it reaches the next closing bracket, it's going to say I'm done with this statement here. And in this case, because there wasn't a third closing bracket, for this if statement up here, when PHP reaches the end of the file, it's going to say, hey, I never received a closing brace for this if statement up here. It's supposed to see 3 different braces. And that's why the error, it points to the error down here, because it sort of works inward out, and that it sees, okay, this if statement was closed, this if statement was closed, but this first one wasn't. So even though we omitted the curly brace on this most internal if statement, it's generating an error for out here. And as you can see, the error, it says unexpected end. And basically what that's meaning is that it reached the end of the file and it was looking for a closing curly brace for this if statement. So if we actually, so that's how one error that can be really deceiving, because you might be looking at it and say, well, there's no error on line 76, and the reason is because it's a brace that was maybe omitted. And the reason I put multiple sample text lines here is because it is to demonstrate how it's going to show the error on a line way down further from where it occurred. So for example, this is something that can happen, and it may throw you an error that doesn't make sense, and that's why, is because you may have omitted a curly brace 100 lines prior in your code. So if we go ahead and put this curly brace back in, appropriately close that if statement, and we run it again, everything should work out fine. And there it is. Now, one of the useful techniques you can do for debugging conditional control structures is tracing the execution of your code, which is kind of what we did, where we looked through the code, and for example, we looked at debug.txt, or example, actually if we go to nested.php, we can say, okay, let's say we provided a function and an argument variable as get variables. So we would trace down our code and we would say, okay, we start here, function's not equal to null. Okay, I'm in here. Then we're going to proceed further down. Argument's not equal to null. I enter here. Then we go to function, and then we go through and evaluate, which the different case statements are, and say, okay, is it compared to date? If it does, we echo this, we break out of it, and then we break all the way back out to the beginning. That's sort of tracing through your code and sort of visually reasoning where the code is going to progress. One trick you can do is to include echo statements at the beginning of each conditional statement or conditional control structure or switch case with a brief message that's going to let you know that the statement group or case was entered. And what that's going to do is, and you only use this when you're debugging because it's going to output messages that you wouldn't want to see on a production site, is let's say you know that you're evaluating an if condition that's 3 ifs deep within your file. If you put a debug statement at the beginning of every time you enter an if statement, then you know that when you look at your output, when you run it test, you should see 3 debug statements. And if you don't, it sort of gives you a clue. If you only see 1, if you only see 2, it gives you a clue as to maybe where your error is occurring. Maybe you're not entering a particular if statement. When the debug statement doesn't show up, you can say, well, why didn't I enter this if statement? And it can clue you into where that error is happening. So if we actually go back and look at another file called debugging.php, it's the same file as nested.php. Except that it has debug statements added. So if we go to debugging.php and we look at the code, we can see that starting from the first if statement, after each if statement was entered, we output a small statement that says debug. Function was not equal to null because that's this test condition here. And then once we enter the second if statement, we say argument not equal to null. Then for each case, so that we know when we've entered a case, we've matched a case in our switch function, we also echo a debug statement. This one says, okay, we're calling the date function. Here we're calling the string to upper function. And what that'll do is let you trace through and make sure you're going through all of the conditional control structures that you're supposed to, meaning that this test condition here was met, this test condition here was met, and this test condition here was met, for example, if we were using the date function. So if we actually go back now with these debug statements included, and we run our code, we call the function, we see the output of our debug statements. We can see the first one, debug function is not equal to null. So that tells us, okay, we successfully got into this first if statement. Debug argument not equal to null. Well, that debug statement means that we got into this second if statement. Debug calling date, that means that we match the date case in our switch function. And so therefore we know that we've gone through and met all of the test conditions that we were supposed to meet for our script, and that provides a way of giving us feedback in case there's an error. So for example, if I go back and were to, let's again go to change this date to date 1 so that it doesn't match. So we have an error there. And we save it and run the script again. Two things are going to happen. One is we're not going to get the formatted date. We're going to see an unexpected debug statement saying the default case was reached, which we're going to wonder why is that, and then we're going to see invalid function requested. Now if we go back and look at our code and sort of trace through that, and let's look at the actual code. Well, in the output we first saw that function not equal to null and argument not equal to all debug statements were output. So we know that we've entered this if statement. We know that we've entered this if statement. The next debug statement that occurs in our output is default case reached. So let's continue tracing through the program. We're in this if statement. We enter the function statement. We should be hitting this debug statement here, but instead we're outputting default case is reached, which means we're reaching the default case, which means that for whatever reason the value that we expected to match the date case up here didn't match. And sure enough, if we go ahead, this will clue us in and say, oh wait a minute, why didn't the date case match? Okay, we had a typo on the date. And what that'll allow you to do is then you can go back and refresh the page, and you can see that it's working now. And so that's a way to help you debug very complex nested control structures, and it's quite a useful technique of basically just outputting simple debug statements, as they're called, while you're in development to make things easier to figure out what's going on. So for today's homework challenge, I want to have you do something kind of similar to what we did today with our script that allowed you to select a function and then an argument. And it's going to accept 3 get parameters, one called operation, one called left op, and one called right op. Basically what these are going to refer to, operation is going to refer to one of the 4 basic arithmetic operations. Left op and right op are going to refer to left and right operands of an arithmetic operation. We're going to let operation take on one of 4 different values. It can be add, subtract, multiply, or divide. And in this case we're using these abbreviated strings. And so what's going to happen is if it receives a left op and a right op variable from get, and it receives an operation that's one of these 4 values, it's going to perform that operation on these values. Now, what I would like you to do is have it output an error message if no operation is provided. So operation would be equal to null if we're using the short variables that we've been using with the ternary operator. It's going to output an error message if both the left op, and you'll notice the keyword here and, which is going to imply a logical operator, and right op are not provided. Not also. That's going to denote a logical operation. Then also output an error message if you provide an operation value, but it's not one of the 4 that are allowed. And then finally, if the user tries to divide by 0, I want you to output a message. Your solution is going to look similar to what we did today with the nested.php example, in that you should be using nested if, else, and switch statements. And your switch statement should make use of a default case, and that will allow you to achieve all the functionality we've just described. And then what you need to do is test each of the different cases, supply some different variables, left op, right op, and operations. So you're going to test that all the different operations work: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, along with providing different variable left op and right op numbers to make sure that they're performing the operations. The other thing that you're going to do is you're going to try to divide by 0 to make sure you get that divide by 0 error. And then after you've done that, or if you're actually having problems figuring out how to get it, I want you to go ahead and add debug statements to each conditional structure like we did in our example today. So once you enter each if statement, add a debug statement that says debug in if statement number 1. And then also do that for each case in the switch statement. So if you're going to, for example, if you're hit the case add when you're comparing against the variable operation against a number of cases, and you compare it against add, ADD, when it hits that case, you output a debug statement saying performing the addition operation. So that'll give you practice using the debug statements. And then just one other note is to be sure to indent your code properly and make sure you're not missing any curly braces or break statements. and just follow the coding conventions that we've talked about in today's lesson. Thank you for watching. Look forward to seeing you next time.